Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Yoga 101. It's just kind of an overview of yoga and what types of people might want to try yoga, and some pros and cons, different things you want to do, different complementary type approaches. But again, yoga is a very complementary type wellness approach. There's other things that are strong in certain areas. Yoga is very much about balance, alignment, breathing, very similar to Pilates, which I've spoke about before in another presentation. It's a different approach. It's much older. We'll talk about the history of yoga and how it's developed over time. It's obviously a big, huge thing right now, especially in the West. It's become very commercialized, and there's a lot of benefits to it. And we're going to talk about some new modern day things that have been done with yoga, but also some traditional things that have been developed and have kind of spawned a lot of different approaches to health and wellness. And we'll start from here. So the first slide, number one, obviously attention active members. For credits towards LMHF Wellness Program Part 2, you must watch the video in its entirety and comment on each video with your name. Once confirmed by LMHF, your comments and name will promptly be removed. Thank you very much. Okay, so number one, the origins of yoga. So the asanas or postures or poses. So typically it's not called an exercise, it's a pose because a lot of these poses you're actually holding. So it's known as a static, basically, posture. There are different types of yoga where you're actually moving through, like power yoga and things like that, but most of the standard asanas or postures are holds. So it's holding for a certain amount of time. Now that time is actually considered time under tension, so you're still working to hold that posture, and it's really making that mind-body connection stronger. So that's obviously a big thing with yoga. It's very mind-body, spiritual, breathing, postural type stuff. So it's not just do this exercise, jump on this machine. It's a lot more thinking, right? So there's a lot more going on. It's not just holding a posture, trying to balance. I know a lot in the media, there's been a lot of these pictures of people doing these crazy yoga flexibility things. That is really just on the extreme end of things. It's not standard yoga postures and positions. But basically, a lot of the research I did thinks that yoga originated about 5,021 years ago. So that is a long time ago. It's been used for eons, basically, in the Ayurvedic culture. So there's a lot of different postures and things that they would use to either, release things that were tight or just kind of get back in touch with your body. So there's a ton of different things that had started, but really as things evolved and changed, and as yoga came to the West, which about the late 19th or 20th century, things changed quite a bit. Some of the Sanskrit names stayed as it evolved and changed and came to the West. And some studios and instructors still use the Sanskrit names. A lot of higher level yoga certification companies do use the Sanskrit names. The standard like gym yoga, they're not going to use that. They're going to use the common, names for things, downward dog and things like that, and child's pose. So they don't use the Sanskrit names. Some people that want to get more into that, I've had lots of yoga instructors I work with, they use Sanskrit names all the time, because probably that's the way they were taught. But Hatha yoga is basically is a form of physical exercise which evolved in the West. So most of what is here in the West is based on Hatha yoga, and that's basically just a permutation or adaptation that the West adopted for like a group yoga or private practice. So a lot of people nowadays do yoga in their homes. You're going to be doing yoga on cruises and vacations, and there's obviously studios and gyms and all everything in between, and obviously all different lines of yoga clothing and so on and so forth. The whole commercial end of it has really exploded. But obviously, getting back to the benefits and the reason why you want to be doing yoga are focusing on a couple different factors we'll talk about. Okay, so again, the Western style yoga we'll talk about. So they've been changed and altered based on the population they're looking to work with. So number one, like a chair yoga program. I've worked in a lot of gyms where they have chair yoga. It's more for seniors or older people or people with limitations or injuries. So you can still be doing yoga but using a chair for balance, because a lot of these movements typically number one, when you're doing yoga, you're always barefoot or in socks. Number two, if you don't have good balance, you're not going to be doing a lot of that. So the chair is kind of acts as a support or brace in case you lose your balance. But that is one that is something you can modify and use. Hatha yoga, again, is the basis. But then there's vinyasa, there's flow, there's power yoga, there's all different styles, and they have all different approaches. There's DDP yoga, which was a former pro wrestler, WWF wrestler, I believe, who started it because he was trying to help wrestlers overcome a lot of their injuries. So there's a lot of focus on balancing the body, small muscles, similar to Pilates but in a different frame. Pretty much all yoga is using limited to no tools at all. It's really just using your body. And then there's obviously hybrid styles of yoga. There's cat yoga and there's dog yoga and goat yoga, where basically you're doing yoga with animals, kind of hopping around and wandering around. So there's a lot of different interesting approaches to it. There's also obviously hot yoga or Bikram style yoga. So that's actually changing the environment in which you're doing yoga. So some of them are very cold and some are very hot. And the heat actually increases flexibility, makes you more pliable. The cold actually stimulates kind of a shiver response. And there's pros and cons to all those different styles. Obviously, if you sweat a lot, I would be very careful doing hot yoga because you could become dehydrated pretty quick, and it could affect your blood pressure. But there's still benefits to that kind of stuff. Just doing it safely is very important. Make sure to check with your doctor because that can be a bit more extreme. But most of yoga, like this yoga pose here, is what you're going to see as a typical yoga pose, where you're just holding that pose for a certain amount of time and then moving from one to the next. There are different types like power yoga where you're actively moving through it. So it's kind of this one to the next to the next. So it's not much of this holding yoga. There's different types where you're holding these postures for an extremely long period of time. So really kind of focusing on taxing your system, both your muscular system but also your mental system. Just try to hold that. So there are different components. Obviously, like I said, yoga is very much about breathing as well. It's all about mind-body connection. So there's a lot with that, especially if you're holding a pose. The breathing is very important with that. So again, if you're going to try to do yoga yourself, make sure you really focus on the breathing aspect. And there's many different ways you can get into yoga, and we'll talk about that as we go. So here are some of the basic benefits, and there's a huge list, but these are some of the basics. So number one is body awareness. So especially postural type things, balance. A lot of people sit for work for very long periods of time, get a lot of tension. That was the original thing why yoga really expanded in this country, because people are sitting for far too long. So it's really getting you out of your seat and kind of on your feet. Some of it's on the mat or on the floor, but most of it is really focused on balance and posture. Flexibility is obviously a huge thing. People always complain they have very tight hamstrings. A lot of that comes from just sitting for extended periods of time. So yoga is about trying to balance those muscles off. So one muscle isn't tight and the other muscle is really weak. So it's a lot of that balance points. Mindfulness obviously is a huge part of it. Meditation and yoga go very well hand in hand, and they've been most classes and instructors use a lot of meditation as well for the whole mind-body connection. But improved posture is the key. I think most people would say they could always improve their posture. A lot of this is based on very tight muscles, and the opposing muscles are very weak, so it's kind of uncoordinated. So a lot of what this is improving your posture by holding these postures and positions and lengthening your muscles. That's what a lot of these yoga postures are. It's to try to reduce stress off your joints and just get things back in line. Obviously, stress reduction is a big part of it. Anytime you're focusing on breathing and the breath and mind-body, you're kind of getting away from the stresses that are on our backs at all points. So that's obviously a big part of it. Boosting your immunity is a big part as well, because you're actively moving. So your lymphatic system is a huge part of your immune system, and has no pumping mechanism other than movement. So moving through and holding these yoga positions will actually help boost your immunity. Lung function as well, obviously from all the focus on breathing. Most of us are very shallow breathers. The more we focus on that, the more we can relax. It actually lowers your resting heart rate. The more oxygen you get in your body, the lower your resting heart rate. So anytime you can take stress off your heart, the better off you're going to be now and for the years to come. Detoxification, a lot of that's going to come from sweating. Sweating and also breathing. You're exhaling carbon dioxide out. You're sweating out, salts and things that are sitting on your skin. So there's a lot of detoxification happening. It's almost like a cleanse, especially if you're doing hot yoga. Afterwards, you just feel very sweaty, but you also feel very detoxified. So your body's pushing things out. The key, though, is obviously making sure you're drinking lots and lots of water, especially if you sweat a lot during a class, or if you're dehydrated going into a class, you get cramps, and you don't want your muscles cramping up in the middle of a class. So those are some things you want to focus on as you go into this stuff. And again, like I discussed, a lot of this has been kind of focused as women only. Women do yoga. That's not really true at all. There's a lot of very important things that can be done for using yoga for athletes, actors, musicians, people that are in chronic pain. All use these different types of yoga poses, and sometimes they call them stretches or exercises that really help them long term. So again, there are a ton of benefits with yoga for men. It's not just for women. There's a lot of things that help with your sleep, with muscle development, with posture, alignment. All those things are really important, and they really do help men just as much as women. So sometimes it might be intimidating for a man to go in a class full of women, and I've taught those classes before. I've been in those classes, and sometimes some of these things, standing on one leg and doing these balanced positions can be more challenging than lifting a heavy weight, which is pretty simple. So it can be intimidating. I understand that. I've had plenty of people come into different classes that I've done where they're mostly women, and the women outdo the men because there's different things that men are not used to doing. So it can be, quite humbling if it's really difficult to do. Again, these are a lot of different postures and positions that are not, they look simple, but until you get into it, they're really not that simple. And again, most of this stuff is always done barefoot or in socks. So having that, being out of sneakers and having to have that ground contact, it changes a lot of different things. So it really challenges your balance because now the muscles in your feet have to grab, whereas if you're using sneakers, those sneakers are kind of the tread on the bottom as well as the arch support are kind of artificially creating a stable point. So once you get into your bare feet, your toes can actually grab and hold. So it works a lot more with your body and how your anatomy should really work. Okay, so basic equipment now. This stuff is so cheap and easy to get now. I mean, there's so many yoga mats and they're so cheap. I would always recommend if you're going to get into this, get a decent yoga mat because you're going to want to be cleaning it. The real cheap ones are basically almost disposable. They'll last for a certain amount of time, but then they just kind of shred and they're almost like spongy, so they don't really last, or they don't hold up to cleaning because they're not very durable. There's a lot of other mats that are not that expensive that you can clean them over and over again and they stay pretty clean. Again, you're going to be sweating on the mat and they're kind of like a sponge, so somewhat absorbent. So you want to be able to clean it pretty consistently to keep it clean because bacteria and whatnot will build up on that. But basically you just need a yoga mat. Typically it's going to be a pair of yoga blocks, and those blocks are going to be used for different hand positions and propping. They're really simple. A lot of made of either foam or cork is pretty common, and they're used for propping in different positions and different poses you would actually use them in. Some instructors use bolsters or props as well as the blocks, but those are pretty standard. Yoga apparel, obviously yoga pants, and that's been a huge marketing thing for years. They just make the exercise a bit easier to work with versus shorts and things like that. But you don't have to buy expensive yoga apparel. It's not about that. That's the commercial side of it. I mean, a lot of it very nice and good stuff. Some of it has different materials that are very breathable, which help with wicking away heat and sweat. Others have different chemicals in them that are supposed to reduce odor and bacteria and things like that. But again, I mean, you don't need all that stuff. T-shirt and shorts. Some men will just be shorts to do this stuff. But the main thing is you have to be comfortable, you have to be able to get in these positions. If you're wearing tight-fitting clothing, there's a chance you could actually rip your clothing if it's too tight. So that's the thing, is a lot of stuff is very stretchable and will work with your body, whereas you don't need that flexibility for just going to a gym typically as much. So again, very simple equipment, nothing crazy, nothing really expensive. I mean, you don't even need a mat. You could be using a rug if you wanted to. It's just for comfort. But again, this Western style yoga is very much focused on simple things, really just your body and some equipment that's just gonna, doesn't cost much and very simple to use. Okay, so how do you practice? So it's not really called a workout, it's basically your yoga practice, right? So you're practicing on getting better every time. So if you have a home studio, obviously you could just set a little area. Lots of people I know have a small yoga area that they have a mat, blocks, all their stuff ready to go. You don't need anything fancy, simple stuff. If you're going to a yoga studio, you can typically get private instruction or group instruction. So the group is typically smaller in a studio. It's not going to be a huge, 20 or 30 people. Some studios will pack the studio so tightly, they'll be mat to mat. So they maximize the space as much as possible. So if you have any issues, I'm sure with COVID and whatnot, they're not doing anything like that. And obviously I do a lot of virtual stuff as well. But basically in a standard year, sometimes these mats will be mat to mat. So there's no place even to walk in between. But it's kind of that community energy and effort that goes into it. So it's really, symbiotic. If you go to yoga class at a gym, that's going to be a large room typically. Kind of same aerobics room, a classroom they're going to use for different purposes. But again, whenever you get into a larger environment, there's less and less instruction. So if you're doing something wrong, you might have looked at the person next to you and they're doing it wrong, so it just kind of permeates through the group. Whereas if you're watching the instructor, they don't have the time to come around and correct each person. So in a large gym format, there's a lot less instruction, it's a lot cheaper, but you really should, obviously your practice should be getting better and better as you go along. So there's limited direction in a large class. You should kind of have a background, know what you're doing before you jump into that. Otherwise you might be doing something wrong and you potentially could be injuring something or irritating something. So it's best to kind of, if you are just getting into it, maybe start off with an intro course. Some places offer an intro course where they'll break down each pose and go through the positioning, the breathing, what not to do, and then develop from there. I did that myself when I first got into yoga. I took an intro course and it was about 6 weeks long. I think it was about an hour and a half each time. We only did a couple poses at a time, and it really made me understand what to do. So when I jumped into actual classes, I had no problem doing that. Prior to that course, I had just gone into a yoga studio with a friend of mine, and I was so lost. By the time I would get to a pose, everyone was going to the next one. So it really was not the best experience. So going through an introduction course, which is pretty standard in most yoga studios and or gyms, that's the best route to go, because then you have an understanding and basis of when they call it the next posture, you already know what you have to do. Now obviously there's a lot of outdoor yoga now, different spaces. There's even yoga on stand-up paddle boards. Again, there's a lot of interesting permutations in the West that have taken place. All right, when we look at intensity levels for yoga, your heart rate is typically low to moderate. You're not going to be doing much where your heart rate is going to be real high, unless it's, again, one of those new style, there's hip-hop yoga, there's cardio yoga, power yoga, and those are usually hybrid, so they're kind of combining different components. A lot of these health and fitness instructors are pretty creative and they make their own combinations, but they've strayed so far away from Eastern style yoga, it's almost not even yoga anymore. So they're using very little bits and pieces of what yoga is about in these new styles. So typically though, in most yoga, it's a very low to moderate heart rate. You're not jacking your heart rate up. It's not hardcore exercise. It's more an activity, but again, it's more about relaxation, stress reduction, getting back to that mind-body connection a lot of us lack. So again, you're not going to get a lot of cardio out of this. So there are other things you want to be doing, just like Pilates, to complement this. So some of the complements I would suggest for an overall wellness program would be some type of cardiovascular or interval training. Whether it's using a spin bike, airdyne bike, treadmill, something where you're actively staying at a certain heart rate or doing intervals up and down. Because yoga, again, is great at its components and what it does really well, but there's nothing that can do everything really well. So that would be one thing, weight or interval training, using weight training. So you have cardiovascular training, doing intervals with some type of cardio equipment. They have weight training or interval training using something, you could be doing using dumbbells or something like that for the interval training. So 2 different ways to approach that. Obviously 10,000 steps a day is obviously a basis or foundation for any type of health and wellness program. And then obviously proper nutrition. Now when it comes to nutrition, with yoga, there's a lot of focus on plant nutrition. So plant-based nutrition, it's a lot of vegetarianism, veganism, getting away from eating meats and things like that, and that's all personal choice. But with any program, you have to watch what you're eating. Cutting out fast foods, processed foods, sugary drinks as much as you can. So in the yogic approach, there's a lot more focus on natural foods, whole foods, fruits and vegetables, grains, things like that. So it's a healthful approach, not just mentally, physically, but nutritionally as well. There is that kind of component to combine all that stuff together. So that is a big component in yoga, is to kind of obviously be more mindful for the planet and yourself, and do as much as you can to help yourself and to help others over time. A couple contraindications or limitations we'll look at is always obviously talk to your doctor before you start any program. Typically they're pretty pretty knowledgeable about yoga and things like that. And there's always modifications. If you have any joint problems, any balance problems, anything like that, there's always modifications. If you're working with an instructor, they're going to be very well versed at modifying a position. Because if you look at the typical picture of someone doing yoga, they're doing all these crazy balance things or super flexible splits. And again, that's just kind of that's the smallest point or most extreme part of yoga. It's not about that. Everyday people do yoga all the time. It's not about how you're impressing people with how flexible you are. That's unfortunately what a lot of people see yoga as. But if you have any joint issues, balance problems, flexibility problems, breathing limitations, any different body types, there's always modifications for those things. So it's not like, I have this or that, I can't do it. There's always a way to modify. I don't think there's any real serious, obviously with the goats and things like that, maybe stepping on you, that might be an issue. But in general, there's a lot of modifications that an instructor can do. If you're doing yoga by yourself, there's so many yoga apps, there's books, there's obviously videos, there's video courses, virtual sessions you can do for yoga instructors. There's so many things, but a lot of it is, again, being around other people doing it. It's a lot of camaraderie and just connection of energy when you're with other people. I know plenty of people that do yoga on their own as well, and it's just part of their daily practice and just keeps them healthy, and there's a meditation component with that as well. So it's all about what you're looking to do, and it's definitely a complementary type of approach if you're looking for a well-rounded wellness long term. And again, you could start as a child. I know that they do yoga a lot in schools, up until senior centers are doing yoga. So it's really everyone, athletes, everyone can benefit quite a bit from yoga because it has very specific benefits, and pretty much the list is endless. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. But thank you for listening.